Ezekiel 33:3.
Origins of Christmas, birth date of Christ. We're looking at part 2. So we're going to start off with the review from last week. Last week we took a look at the origins of Christmas, but we came from like a Bible perspective. So what we did first was we outlined what holidays can we actually find in the Bible. We looked at what holidays are available in the Old and New Testament, and we went through all the holy days and then just kind of outlined which ones were days that you had to keep versus which ones were days that were not expected to be observed. They weren't like a mandatory observance. So to start the review, there's 9 holy days of the Bible. If you don't see the holy day listed here, that means it doesn't exist anywhere in the Bible. Now, there are Hebrew names, obviously, and then English names and some alternates, but there's just 9 holy days. There's just obviously a couple different ways to say them. So there's major and minor holy days. So we've got 9 holy days total. We've got 7 that are major and 2 that are minor. So our major holidays are Passover. That starts us off in March. That's the beginning of the year in the Bible. That's in the month of Nisan. Next up, we've got the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Then we have the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks, which is also known as Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Tabernacles, also known as the Feast of Booths, or in Hebrew it's Sukkot, or the Feast of Tents. And then our minor holidays, we have 2. Feast of Dedication, also known as Hanukkah, which we're right in the middle of, and then Feast of Lots, also known as Purim. So our minor holidays and major holidays, as we covered last week, the difference between them is the major holidays were given by God, the minor holidays were created by man. So Hanukkah and the Feast of Lots. Feast of Lots shows up in the book of Esther. That's when that started to take place, and that was a holiday that the Jews had ordained themselves. And then same with Hanukkah, that was from the book of Maccabees. These other 7 feasts, though, these other 7 feasts were all provided by God, and that's why they are major holidays. 4 holy days are practiced in the New Testament, so you can see them by name. So if there's a discrepancy in the sense that in the Old Testament we had one set of holidays, and then the New Testament we had another set of holidays, I've heard that argument before. People thought under the Old Covenant versus the New Covenant is how you kind of explain Christmas and Easter. It's not the case, though. In the New Testament, you have Passover mentioned in 1 Corinthians 5:6. You've got the Feast of Unleavened Bread mentioned in Acts 12:3. You've got the Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost, mentioned in Acts 2. And then the Feast of Dedication, or Hanukkah, mentioned in the book of John, chapter 10:22. So 3 of these holy days, Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, and Feast of Weeks, these were feasts that showed up in the Old Testament. These were feasts that were given by God, and these were feasts that were commanded to continue forever. So we can see they definitely continued forever because they're in the New Testament, at least these 3. We can presume the other ones were, because obviously if if holidays were supposed to be commanded to be carried out forever, and we can see 3 out of the 6 that were commanded in the New Testament, it's a pretty safe assumption they kept the other ones as well. So there are 6 holy days to be kept forever. So there were 7 major holidays, but 6 of them were to be kept forever. The 6 that were to be kept forever were the Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost, Feast of First Fruits, Day of Atonement, Feast of Tabernacles, Passover, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. All 6 of those holy days were given by God, and they were to be kept forever, and that's recorded in the book of Leviticus, chapter 23. There was one that was not explicitly said to be kept forever. That was the Feast of Trumpets, and that also shows up in Leviticus 23. The other 2 holy days, they show up later in the Bible, obviously not in Leviticus. So weather in Israel during the solstice, that was something we took a look at. So during the winter solstice, what's the weather like in Israel? We found out, yes, it does in fact snow in Israel. Here's January 9th, 2019, 1.2 to 1.5 centimeter or inches of snow, by Mount Hermon, that's northern Israel. This is Jerusalem in December. We can clearly see they get snow there. And then here's somewhere a little bit closer to the Temple Mount. And basically with this here, we can see that there's snow in the wintertime in Israel, and that's important because that's going to have an overlap with part of our biblical story in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The birth of Christ in the Bible, we looked at that last week as well. We looked in the book of Mark. So in the beginning of Mark, we can see it starts off with John the Baptist. So if we take a look at verse 4 in chapter 1, it says, "And so John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness, preaching a baptism of repentance for forgiveness of sins." So at this point, we're dealing with a much later period in time. So this is way after Christ's birth. You cannot find any details on the birth of Christ in the book of Mark. It starts too late. In the book of John, it talks about the word becoming flesh. And then once we reach John, verse 19 to 28, it starts talking about John the Baptist again, denying being the Messiah, which again brings you to the confirmation that this is too late in the story to talk about the birth of Christ. The book of Matthew. Matthew is the first place we can really see anything about the birth of Christ. So chapter 1, we saw the genealogies mentioned for the first bit. And then we see the piece about Mary pregnant through the Holy Spirit. And then we get to chapter 2. In chapter 2, the Magi see Herod in Jerusalem, and then they go towards Jesus. And then the Magi come to worship him. Joseph escapes with Jesus to Egypt, and Herod kills all the children who are 2 years of age and younger. And then we keep going in our story here where Joseph returns back from Egypt to Nazareth. So the next time we see Jesus in the book of Matthew is in chapter 3, and then by the chapter 3, he's being baptized by John. So again, much too old. So any details we're going to grab about Christmas or any details we're going to grab about the birth of Christ, we'd have to grab it from chapter 1 and 2 of Matthew, because Mark, we have nothing, and in John, we also have nothing. Book of Luke, we have some more details. Birth of Christ is captured again in chapters 1 and chapter 2. Once you reach chapter 2, verse 22, Christ is now 12 years old, which means it's too late to capture details surrounding his birth. So again, if you're going to take a look at, for example, the birth of Christ and align it with Christmas and the celebrations, traditions, customs involved with Christmas, the name Christmas isn't listed anywhere in the Bible. The festivities, customs, and traditions, if they were listed, you would find them in chapter 1 or 2 of Luke or chapter 1 and 2 of Matthew. The only thing that you see in Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke 1 and 2 is the birth of Christ, the story that surrounds it, but you can't get the time, you definitely can't get the season. If you were to guess the season, though, judging by the fact that you had shepherds in the field and also the fact that there was a census, it's highly unlikely a Roman leader would make people walk all across the empire in the middle of the winter solstice. And it's also unlikely that shepherds would be in the middle of a field, obviously in the winter solstice. So a lot of reasons as to why we don't know the time that Christ was born. The Roman census during the birth of Christ. So if we take a look where Jerusalem is and we take a look where Galilee is, that's quite the voyage. I mean, it's an hour and 40 minutes by car, 146 kilometers. So 146 kilometers during the winter solstice, probably not a good idea. Christmas was not celebrated until the 3rd century. So if this is the birth of Christ, you would think that there'd be some kind of tradition recorded in the book of Acts or maybe in Corinthians or any of the latter books after the crucifixion that would speak about it. When we took a look at Christmas, it actually wasn't celebrated at all anywhere in the Roman Empire until the 3rd century. So it's pretty late. We're looking at hundreds of years after the birth of Christ. This is when they start to celebrate his birthday. A little bit suspicious. We looked in the Catholic Encyclopedia, and interestingly enough, the 2 early church fathers, Irenaeus and Tertullian. Irenaeus and Tertullian were early church fathers, and they had a calendar of feasts. So basically, every feast for every saint was recorded on these calendars, and Christmas was not recorded on their list of feasts. In 320 AD, December the 25th was first celebrated in Rome as the birth of Christ. So the very first time, historically speaking, that anyone celebrated the birth of Christ, 320 AD in the Roman Empire. So we're actually looking almost 300 years after Christ was the first time they celebrated his birthday. In 350 AD, we heard that Pope Julius I, the Bishop of Rome, he is notable for asserting the authority of the Pope over Arian Eastern bishops, as well as setting December the 25th as the official birth date of Christ. So the first feast of Christmas was celebrated in the 320s, but it was made official that it was the birth date of Christ in 350. So it was Pope Julius I who made the announcement that Christ was born in on December the 25th, World Encyclopedia 1966. 354, the Bishop of Liberius of Rome ordered the people to celebrate on December the 25th. Okay, so first we had it made the official birthday of Christ, and then we see in 354, it's actually ordered by a bishop to be observed. He probably chose the date because the people of Rome already observed it as the feast of Saturn, celebrating the birthday of the sun. Okay, so we have an overlap here. Right from the Catholic Encyclopedia, we can see that there was already an existing feast that occurred on December the 25th, and it looks like that Rome was trying to merge the two feasts together. The question is, or the comment is, other gods were worshipped in the Roman Empire. So you have to understand that it would be pretty cut and dry if it was just Christianity existing in Rome, and then that was the official religion of Rome. Problem is that the Romans had multiple gods. They had gods before Christ, they had gods after Christ, and they had gods that were competing with Christianity at the exact same time Christianity was kind of entering Rome. In the Catholic Encyclopedia, when we read about Mithraism, it says, Mithraism, a pagan religion consisting mainly of the cult of ancient Indo-Iranian sun god Mithra. Notice it's a sun god. It entered Europe from Asia Minor and after Alexander's conquest, spread rapidly over the whole Roman Empire in the beginning of the era, reaching its zenith during the 3rd century and vanished under the repressive regulations of Theodosius at the end of the 4th century. So this Alexander that we're talking about, it says it entered Europe from Asia Minor. When we say it, we're talking about the sun god Mithra. Mithraism actually came from Asia. And Alexander the Great is who we're talking about. So when it says Alexander's conquest, that's Alexander the Great. And if you know Alexander the Great and the Greeks had gods like Helios and Apollos. Apollos and Helios were both sun gods. So you can see where these Greek gods came from. The Greek gods came from Asia. And here you can see in the Catholic Encyclopedia, the Greek gods that came from Asia eventually made their way into Rome, and they were brought in by Alexander. Helios, Mithras is one god. So here we can see in the first sentence, it says, Helios and Mithra are the same thing. If the Greeks called it Helios, well then the Romans called the same deity Mithra, but they're both sun gods. Sunday was kept in the honor of Mithra. Well, that would make a lot of sense where the sun day comes from. It's the day of the sun. Since Rome had multiple gods that were sun gods, it would make sense that their day of worship would be on the Sunday. And the 16th of each month was sacred to him as mediator. This is interesting because, of course, Christ in the Bible is called the mediator. He mediates between you and the Father. So here we have a sun god that's a mediator, and then we have Christ that's a mediator. Is it possible that in early Rome there was an overlap between Christ, the Son of God, and then the sun in the sky? We'll see a little bit later. The December the 25th was observed as his birthday, the Nautilus Invicti, the rebirth of the winter sun unconquered by the rigors of the season. So the way that the pagans looked at the year, or at least the cult of Mithra and the cult of Helios, when they looked at the mirror, in the wintertime on the 24th, the sun would be completely dead. Oops. On the 24th, the sun would be completely dead. So it'd be sitting on the horizon. So basically from the 21st of December to the 24th of December, the sun sits on the horizon, and it does so for 3 days. So it makes the sun looks like it's dead. When the sun starts to lift off again on the 25th, the pagans would look at this as the birth of the sun. So the sun goes around the wheel, and that's the wheel of the seasons. And then when it reaches December, it's dead, and then it rebirths again and goes around again in a circle. As a matter of fact, if you pay very close attention to this lesson, you'll figure out where reincarnation came from. 274 AD, Manfred Claus, in his history of the Justinian, I can't read that, Caesar of Justinian. So there's this piece called the Justinian Code. Justinian was in the Byzantine Empire, but this quote says, Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, was the official sun god of the later Roman Empire and a patron of soldiers. The Temple of Sun was a temple in the campus of Agrippa in Rome, built by Aurelian on the 25th of December, 274. The Roman Emperor Aurelian dedicated the temple to Sol. The god was favored by emperors after Aurelian and appeared on their coins until the last third part of the reign of Constantine I. So look at the dates here. Christmas didn't exist until the 3rd century. If we take a look here in 274, one of the Roman emperors, this is Aurelian, he dedicated a temple to Sol, which was a sun god. And he dedicated the temple to the sun god Sol on December the 25th. That's extremely close to when they started to first celebrate Christmas, because it was 350 AD when they said that they had ruled that Christmas was to be observed. 315 AD, temple priests of Sol in the city of Rome. Constantine might not have patronized Christianity alone. He built a triumphal arch in 315 to celebrate his victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, which was decorated with images of the goddess Victoria, and sacrifices were made to pagan gods as its dedication, including Apollo, Diana, and Hercules. Absent from the arch are any depictions of Christian symbolism. Okay, so when did Sunday become the day of worship? 321 AD. So here's 315. Just before Sunday became the Sabbath, because obviously you can't change the Sabbath, it became the Lord's Day. When they switched the Sabbath for the Lord's Day, you'll notice there's only a couple years in between when Constantine had put up these different images of pagan gods and performed sacrifices to when they made Sunday the official day of worship. So really strange here. Again, it looks, and this is speculation, obviously, but it's a pretty good assumption. It's a pretty good assumption to say that if before Christmas you had people worshiping sun gods, and after Christmas you had people worshiping solar gods, that perhaps what fell in the middle had some influence from solar gods. If we take a look in 274, remember 350 is when Christmas was official, 320 is when the feast was first celebrated. So 274, we see Emperor Aurelian, and then on the other side of the coin, we see Sol Invictus. Sol Invictus, notice he has rays coming off of his head, kind of like the rays of the sun. He's got a little whip in his hand too. Here's another image of Sol Invictus, or Sol, the sun god, and you'll always see those rays coming off of the head. And in this depiction here, you can actually see an eagle that's sitting in front of Sol. 313 AD. Now this is Constantine. Now, Constantine's supposed to be a Christian, whereas our other ruler, while he was a solar worshiper, Aurelian, he built a temple to the sun god Mithra. So total explanation as to why we see this on his coin. But when we see Constantine, Constantine's supposed to be pushing Christianity. So 316, he's building idols and he's building an arch with pagan idols and sacrifices on it. 313, he's on a coin, and on the reverse side, you also see the sun god Mithra, same image. You can see the rays on the head and the whip in the hand. This would make sense for Aurelian, but if Constantine's supposed to be the first Christian emperor, no, his symbols are the same thing that you would see with the previous emperor, which were symbols of a solar god. So here are some images of Mithra and Helios Mithra. It doesn't matter, they're actually the same thing. It just depends on which historian you're talking to and where you're situated on the earth. Some people will say Helios, some people will say Apollo, some people will say Mithra, some people will say Sol, some people will say Sol Invictus. It is all the same thing. So here we have Mithra on the left, we've got Sol Invictus on the right. You can clearly tell these are the exact same thing, and Apollo is no different. You can see that the sun gods were typically carried in chariots pulled by four horses. So you would see a man typically with a sun behind his head drawn in a chariot by 4 horses. Saturn was a Roman deity. We saw something very similar. His chariot was drawn by 2 serpents. Odin, we saw, was very similar. Odin was a Norse god, but if you know your Norse mythology actually came from Iran, and the cult of Mithra, which is what we were just studying, is an Iranian cult. So it makes a lot of sense that you'd see similarities between Odin and Mithra and Apollo, because they both came from the same area. And then if you take a look at Thor, Thor is supposed to be son of Odin. Well, they look very similar as well. One's being pulled by wolves, the other one's being pulled by goats. But again, it's this constant theme of an old man flying through the sky. It's a lot easier to see in the Norse mythologies. This is also where we got our Santa Claus from, and our Father Christmas and Old Saint Nick, the concept of being old, Father Time, Old Saint Nick. So you can see here all the overlaps between these different solar deities. The reason why they're always flying is because the sun goes through the sky. It goes from the east to the west, which is why you're always seeing these deities in flight. We saw that Santa Claus of today, a lot of those symbols that we saw with Santa kind of came from Odin. Didn't just come from Odin, it came from a couple places, but the strongest depiction as to who the modern Santa represents today would definitely be your Norse god Odin. All they did was they changed his clothing from green and blue into a red instead. And the red actually represented the Amanita muscaria mushroom, as we talked about before, that grew under the Christmas tree. We also saw that this archetype goes back even farther than the Norse gods. This goes all the way back to the first sun god. First sun god was supposed to be Nimrod in the Bible. Nimrod, the guy who built the tower to heaven. You'll notice in the old images of Nimrod, the illustrations look exactly like Santa Claus. We've got our reindeer, we've got our tree. So it looks like the whole celebration of Christmas, just from like a symbolic view, it looks like it originally came from Babylon. And Babylon was the place where the people were basically trying to challenge God. We read about that in Genesis. So the review from part one, this is what we reviewed last week, and now we're going to move into the new content. Last week, we looked at the 9 holy days in the Bible. We covered 7 major, 2 minor. We looked at 4 holy days mentioned in the New Testament. Those holy days were Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost, and Feast of Dedication. We looked at the weather of Israel during the winter solstice. It's obviously cold enough that shepherds wouldn't be in the field, and you probably wouldn't want to walk 100 kilometers with your pregnant wife. We looked at the birth of Christ in the Bible. The only books in the Bible that the birth was mentioned was Matthew and Luke. So if you read Matthew chapter 1 and 2, Luke chapter 1 and 2, you now know everything there is to know about the birth of Christ and the Christmas tradition, because it should be listed in those 4 chapters. Matthew and Luke do not record the date of the birth or the season. None of the customs or traditions of Christmas are practiced today are mentioned anywhere in those books either. Christ was born during a Roman census, which is why his family was traveling. It's very unlikely, I mentioned, that a leader would have people travel during the winter solstice. Irenaeus and Tertullian did not record Christmas in their feasts, in their feast calendar. So Christmas, we found out, was not actually celebrated until nearly 300 years after Christ. So it was first celebrated in 320 AD, but the calendar that Tertullian and Irenaeus had no record of it in their times. So Tertullian and Irenaeus were existing around 175 AD. If there were Christians practicing this feast every year on the 25th, they would have had on their calendar. First time it shows up in the calendar is in the 320s, though. Pope Julius I officially recognized December 25th as Christmas in 350. So remember, first we had a pope that recognized it, and then following that, it was commanded by the next pope, because the Bishop of Liberius of Rome ordered the people to celebrate Christmas 354 AD. So you can clearly tell that if a bishop has to order you to celebrate Christmas, you clearly weren't celebrating it before. Before Christ and after, Rome worshipped solar gods. So we took a look. We saw Mithra, Sol, Apollo. These gods showed up in Rome before. And also Saturn was another one. And then we also saw that after Christmas was already created, 350 AD, we still saw the continuation of sun gods worshipped in Rome. And we'll see quite a bit of it actually when we study Saturn in a couple minutes. So here's something very important to become familiar with. This is called the pagan wheel. It associates to the zodiac as well. So if you take a look at it, you can see here December, October, September, August, June, May. So basically I've got my wheel of the year. My wheel is broken into 8 points. So I've got 12 months, but this is broken into 8 points. This is how the pagan wheel breaks apart. I've got my solstice, where I draw a vertical line from top to bottom. I've got my equinox, where I draw a horizontal line. So Mahabon and Astara and winter solstice, Yule and Letha, this is the first cross. In between the first cross, you'll notice that we have Samhain, Imbolc. So the way that they broke apart the year was they had holy days on the solstice and the equinox points, and then they had these. I'm trying to remember. It's a word that they use in Wicca. I think it's called quarter Sabbath or half Sabbath. Anyway, it's this idea of these diagonals here. The diagonals like Samhain, Imbolc, etc. The whole concept of pagan worship was based on the idea of the seasons. So everything was broken down to the solstice and the equinox and the half points. So what's interesting here, I would like to point out, is that keep in mind, this has nothing to do with Christianity. This is a lot to do with things that the Celts would be into, the later Wiccans would be into, the Norse and such would be into. And if you notice here, the days that are listed around here, clearly they're not holidays that we're familiar with. If we look at October 31st, we're familiar with that one because it's not called Samhain. For us, it's called Halloween. It was initially called Samhain's Day. If we take a look over here, Ostara is in spring. It sounds a lot like Easter. If you take a look up here in the winter solstice, you've got Yule. Now, Yule should strike everyone because Yule is something that we talk about around Christmas time. We talk about Yuletide. We talk about Yule log. We talk about Yule as if it's a part of the season. Well, here's the problem. If we're pulling the word Yule and Yule isn't showing up anywhere in the Bible, but Yule shows up on this wheel, that means that's a Celtic holiday, or whoever else would practice this wheel. So you're kind of in a weird position because if you look at this, it's like, well, winter solstice, that was already a holy day that was practiced by people who didn't know God. Why are Christians practicing it? How did we get this strange kind of an overlap going on? So we're going to take a look at the history of Christmas and try to figure out how this happened. The first thing we need to know is we need to know the date of the winter solstice. So we looked at it a little bit. Now, the winter solstice changed. It's not the same date that it used to be. We've had two calendars. One calendar was called the Julian calendar. That was by Julius Caesar. The second calendar was called the Gregorian calendar. We are on the Gregorian calendar today. The Julian calendar was replaced around the 1500s. So on the Julian calendar, there was a historian, his name is Pliny the Elder. In his book called The Natural History, Pliny the Elder denoted that the 25th of December was when the winter solstice began. So normally we would look at the calendar today and we'd say, okay, well, what's the date of the winter solstice? If we go back 2 slides, it tells you winter solstice around 19th to 22nd. Most people would agree your solstice today, December the 21st and June the 21st, and March the 21st and September the 21st. So it's other than 21st. You'll notice, though, in the days of Pliny the Elder, it was on the 25th of December. So the difference was between the two calendars, the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar. The 21st was the same as the 25th. That was the difference between the two of them. So when people would celebrate on the solstice on the 21st on the Gregorian calendar, on the Julian calendar, it would be on the 25th. The next thing we're going to take a look at is the Catholic Encyclopedia. This is a reprint of a very old encyclopedia, and it's got a section that's called Christmas and its Cycle. Probably no better place to look about the history of the church and Christmas than to ask the church itself what its history is. It says the solemnity of Christmas, December the 25th celebrates the birth of Christ. Christmas is the second major feast of the liturgical year. Whenever you see that word liturgical, it means like religious. Just substitute the word religious. Of the religious year in importance after Easter, and commemorates the incarnation of the coming Christ in the flesh. One aspect of the paschal mystery. Christmas is a holy day of obligation for Roman Catholics. So we didn't have it being a holy day of obligation in the Bible. There was no command of it. As a matter of fact, there's nothing even similar to it in there. Within those 9 holy days, we don't have anything here. But it looks like what we can see is after 354, it was a day that Catholics were obligated to practice. Now, keep in mind, at 354 AD, there's no Catholics and Protestants. It's just the church. But of course, since we're speaking from a more modern tongue, since this book was written around the 1800s, at that point, there was the separation. But initially, it would have just all been the church. The earliest mention of the Nativity of Christ on December the 25th can be found on the Chronograph of Philacus, a Roman almanac whose source material can be dated back to 336. Okay, so here we go. The very first place we can find the Feast of Christmas. Remember, it wasn't actually called Christmas, and we're going to get to the name a little bit later. At this point, it's just a feast that shows up on the calendar, and that feast was to commemorate the birth of Christ, the Nativity of Christ. The first calendar that shows up, 336. And that's called the Chronograph of Philocalus. The true birth of Christ is unknown. Okay, so again, Catholic Church is confirming the stuff we learned last week, which is there's nowhere in the Bible you're going to find out the date of Christ. Catholic Church agrees. It says the worldwide census reported back in Luke 2:1-2 cannot be substantiated. So in other words, there were people who actually looked and tried to find the Roman census from the days of Christ. They couldn't find it. So since they couldn't find the Roman census, they couldn't get the season, they couldn't get the date, they couldn't figure it out by the census. There's no way to determine it. So by the late 2nd century, different groups of Christians held divergent ideas on the date of Christ's birth. Okay, so by 2nd century, we have people with all these different ideas in regards to when was it? Was it in December? Was it in September? Some of the dates they came up with were the following. December the 25th was one of the dates. January the 6th or the 10th, and you can see that in Europe. I think they actually call it the Feast of the Epiphany. What they've actually linked that to is in Europe, they're talking about the idea that first the Magi had seen the stars and then they had made their way to the Christ child. This is where this Feast of the Epiphany comes from, because what they're doing is they're basically taking their mark of the solstice and then giving some travel time for the Magi to make their way, which is where you get this Feast of Epiphany on January the 6th or 10th. There was also April the 10th, or May the 20th, or November the 18th, and that was Clement of Alexandria, and he lived in 146 AD, one of the early church fathers. So there is absolutely no consensus in regards to when any of the early church thought that Christ was born. I mean, they're all over the place here. It continues and says, with no evidence for the exact date of Christ's birth and no clear proof of the date at which the feast began to be celebrated, nor its rationale, liturgical historians have developed two non-competitive theories. The theory held by the majority is known as the history of religions hypothesis. In its more conservative form, this theory suggests that the origins of the Nativity feast may be found in a series of striking parallels between the heliocentric religion of late Roman Empire and the Christmas feast. Stop there for a second. I was pointing out the fact that isn't it kind of strange that you have this holiday called Christmas, nowhere in the Bible, and before Christmas, they worshipped heliocentric gods. After Christmas, when it was in 354 AD, was a mandatory observation, they still continued to worship heliocentric gods. And then here I'm looking at the Catholic Encyclopedia, and the Catholic Encyclopedia says there's two major theories, and the majority theory has to do with what? The worship of heliocentric gods. It says, 1, December the 25th was the date of the winter solstice on the Julian calendar. Okay, so that piece that I just showed you on Pliny the Elder, 100% true. The Catholics confirmed the 25th was the solstice on the old calendar. The 21st is the solstice on our new calendar. As solar monotheism made inroads into Roman culture, the solstice was celebrated as the birthday of the sun god. First, Mithras, a private cult of male devotees imported from Persia, and later, Sol Invictus, who was placed at the head of the pantheon of the official Roman state gods by Emperor Aurelian in 274 as a symbolic representation of centralized imperial power. So remember we read in 274 AD, we saw that just before Constantine, Aurelian had made a temple that was dedicated to the sun god Sol. Sun god of Sol is also Mithra. And here we have the Catholics recording in their encyclopedia that it's quite likely that this celebration that happened on the solstice, it's pointing towards your sun gods, Mithra and Sol Invictus, because that was the practice in the past. 2, since the Nativity feast was instituted no earlier than 243 and no later than 336, this would have coincided with the rise of imperial solar worship. So the historians say that it's quite likely by the dates as to when Christmas was formulated, it was likely it had to do with the rise and fall of sun worship in Rome. Patristic sermons and texts of this period, both in the East and West, employed numerous analogies between Christ and the sun. The rising sun is a symbol of his resurrection. Christ as the Son of Justice, Malachi 3:20. And Christ as the true Son, as distinguished from the non-Christian worship of the Son, a mere creature and not the creator. The more extreme form of this hypothesis claims that Christmas represents an appropriation by Christians of the Roman feast of the birth of the invincible sun at the winter solstice, a Christianization or baptizing of the civil feast. Okay, so here it looks like option 3. If you don't like option 1 or option 2 that the historians provided, option 3 is that the church basically tried to Christianize an existing feast day having to do with a solar deity. Regardless, though, the 3 major options you have to explain Christmas, at least coming from the church and its history itself, is that it either came from 1, the winter solstice on the Julian calendar, 2, they were mimicking Mithra, a god that was worshipped in Rome prior and after, or 3, they were trying to Christianize the worship of sun gods such as Mithra. So you can't get away from the idea that this is heavily ingrained with the old worship of the sun. It says such a move might have been intended to set up a distraction for Christians to keep them from participating in the Roman feasts and the excesses of Saturnalia, which preceded it, or the civil new year which followed it, or perhaps to co-opt secular cultural customs in order to strengthen the newly legitimized Christian religion. So this is interesting. We're seeing this last piece here. It says maybe one of the reasons that they had set up Christmas in the first place was to distract Christians from participating in Saturnalia. So since Saturnalia was an old Roman festival, it was the worship of the god Saturn, and people worship Saturn, you actually find out till the 8th century. They worshiped Saturn 400 years after Christmas existed. So it's quite likely then that this might have been a method to get people in Rome to stop worshiping Saturn and instead swap Saturn for Christmas. The chronology of 354, or sorry, the chronography of 354 AD. This is called the calendar of Philocalus. This is the absolute first calendar ever that they were able to find celebrations on the 25th of December. If you take a look on the 17th of December, you have a festival that's called Saturnalia. On the 25th of December, you've got a festival that's called Invictus. This is interesting. Remember, when is this calendar from? 354 AD. Wasn't Christmas made an official holiday that had to be recognized by the church in 354? It was. But look at this. That year, if you look at the calendar, what do we have? Saturnalia was still going on the 17th, and Saturnalia went on for 7 days, went right to the 24th. And then if you look on the 25th, if you look, you see the word Invicti. Yeah, Invictus. December the 25th, Sol Invictus. That's your sun god. So you can see here that all they did was they basically made Christians comfortable with the worship of a sun god by basically making it the personification of Christ. This would make both pagans and Christians be able to operate under one empire and still be happy in regards to their form of worship, because it's blended now. Now the adoption of Christmas. When did people start to actually practice it? We know when it was legally taught to be observed, but it's not like the whole world just started doing it at once. Spain, it was first observed in 384. In Constantinople, which is where Constantine was from, you would think that if Constantine had something to do with Christmas, he would have had it launched in Constantinople, which is named after himself. Christmas was not actually seen in Constantinople until far after Constantine. It was seen in 380 AD. In 380 AD, Gregory of Nazianzus preached a Christmas sermon in Constantinople and referred to himself as the originator of the feast. So even though we can see that Christmas, or the Feast of Christmas, was supposed to be coined in 354, 350, here we see that this Gregory of Nazianzus claims that he was the originator. Not exactly possible, because it actually showed up before him. Palestine, 380 AD. So Palestine, now we're going right to Jerusalem here. In Palestine, the birth of Christ was celebrated on January the 6th until the middle of the 7th century, when December the 25th was accepted. Okay, so this is where Christ lived, right? We're looking at Jerusalem, Palestine. You would think that the people who resided in the area that he lived in would know when he was born. The Christmas King, 800 AD, Charlemagne. On Christmas Day 800, at the third Mass, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Western Christian Empire. So Charlemagne was crowned the Emperor of the Western Empire on Christmas Day. The origin of the word Christmas. So Christmas, Xmas, we'll cover where Xmas came from too. So if you take a look at this word that's on the screen here, it actually says Christ. It says it in Greek. It says Christos. That word with an X and then a P, it says Christos. If you take a look, this symbol that's on your screen is called the chi rho. On the left side of the chi rho, you can see a symbol on the stone, and on the right side, you can see a symbol. It's Alpha and Omega. So we can see the word Christ is then reduced into the letters X and P, because it's the first two letters of the word Christ in Greek. And then we see the Alpha and Omega here. Now, this is how this works. If you take a look, Christmas, we've got Christus. Christus is coming from Christ, obviously. That part should be pretty self-explanatory. And then the Mas part is coming from the word Missa. Missa is believed to be connected to the word Messiah. The reason why you see Xmas sometimes is the X was just the first letter from the Greek word Christ, and the Mass part was coming from Missa, which was pointing to the word Messiah. So in other words, Christ, Messiah, X, Christ, and then Messiah, Mass. That's where Xmas comes from. There's nothing, see, when people were arguing saying that don't take the Christ out of Christmas, It's just they didn't understand that the word Xmas was just writing it in a condensed format, because Christ was still in Christmas written as Xmas. It was just written with the Greek XP. So X was the XP from Christ. Xmas is an abbreviation of Christmas found particularly in print based on the initial letter chi, which is the X in Greek, Christos, Christ, though numerous style guides discourage its use. This abbreviation has precedent in Middle English Xmas, where XP is an abbreviation for, and then Christ again. The origin of the word Christmas. So let's look at Christmas. Christmas is a shortened form of Christ's Mass. The word is recorded as Christus Massi in 1038 and Christus Mess in 1131. There was no Christmas before these 2 dates. You would just call it Christ's birthday, or you would call it the Nativity, right? Because the Nativity word was coming from the idea that it was his birth, because in Latin it's natalus. So here what we're seeing is we're seeing that the actual name Christmas wasn't coined until 1000 AD. Christmas is a compound word originating from the terms Christ's Mass. It is derived from the Middle English Christmas. It is from the Old English Christusmas, a phrase recorded in 1038. Christ, genitive Christes, is from the Greek Christos, a translation of the Hebrew Messiah. And Massi is from the Latin Missa, the celebration of the Eucharist. The form Christen Mas was also historically used, but is now considered archaic and dialectical. It derives from Middle English Christen Mas, literally Christian Mass. Yule or Jule. In Old English, Gyula or Yule referred to the period corresponding to December and January, which was eventually equated with Christian Christmas. Noel. Noel or Noel entered English in the late 14th century and is from the Old French Noel or nail, itself ultimately from the Latin natalis, dies, meaning birth. So of course, when we talk about the nativity is coming from the Latin word natalis. And so Noel is coming from nautilus. So this is all based on the concept of the birth of Christ. So I'm just going to point something out that's extremely important here. If we're talking about Christmas or Noel or the nativity, and the nativity is talking about the birth, that would mean that this whole holy day is centered around the birth of something. If we find that Christ wasn't born on this day, then we must be talking about the birth of something else. Midwinter. The Anglo-Saxons referred to the feast as midwinter, or more rarely as Natuid, which is, again, from the Latin where you get the word nativity, nativitas. So midwinter is another name for like your winter solstice. If you were to say midwinter, December the 21st, or winter solstice, it's all the same thing. Christmas bans. A lot of people aren't aware that Christmas was banned, not only the fact that it had a pretty late kickoff, but it was actually kicked out of different countries. So there's the Puritan Christmas ban of 1647. Puritans condemned the celebration of Christmas, considering it a Catholic invention and the trappings of popery or the rags of the beast. Was Christmas an invention of the Catholics? Absolutely. It was 354 AD. That's when this all started, right? And this was not based off of anything biblical. It was based off of the birth of Christ, which we already know isn't recorded in the Bible. So were the Puritans correct in saying that this was an invention of the Catholics? Of course they were. I mean, it's just the early church. The Puritan Christmas ban was in England and New England. Puritans in both England and New England believed that the state should protect and promote true religion, and that religion should influence politics and social life. Certain holidays were outlawed when the Puritans came to power. In 1647, Parliament outlawed the celebration of Christmas, Easter, and White Sunday. Christmas was forbidden in England until 1660. Puritan Boston Christmas ban, 1659 to 1681. Christmas was outlawed in Boston from 1659. The ban by the Puritans was revoked in 1681 by Governor Edmund Andros. However, it was not until the mid-19th century that celebrating Christmas became fashionable in the Boston region. Plymouth Pilgrims. Puritans again condemned the idea of Christmas, saying it was trappings of the popery. This was in 1620. This was New England. In colonial America, the Pilgrims of New England shared radical Protestant disapproval of Christmas. So here we can see it wasn't just the Pilgrims from Plymouth. It was a lot of Protestants at the time. A lot of Protestants in the 1600s, they knew that Christmas had nothing to do with the birth of Christ. The Plymouth Pilgrims put their loathing for the day into practice in 1620 when they spent their first Christmas day in the New World working, thus demonstrating their complete contempt for the day. Presbyterian Church of Scotland discouraged the observance of Christmas, and though James VI commanded its celebration in 1618, attendance at the church was scant. So 1618 in Scotland. We also had the Puritans in Massachusetts in 1659. In Massachusetts, after the Puritans in England overthrew King Charles I in 1647, among their first items of business after chopping off the monarch's head was to ban Christmas. Parliament decreed that December the 25th should instead be a day of fasting and humiliation for Englishmen to account for their sins. The Puritans of New England eventually followed the lead of those in Old England, and in 1659, the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony made it a criminal offense to publicly celebrate the holiday, and declared that whosoever shall be found observing any such day as Christmas or the like, either by forbidding of labor, feasting, or any other way, was to be subject to a 5-shilling fine. Eastern Church in the 16th century. The Arminians, they never accepted the date of December 25th. So out of all of the Eastern Church, the Arminians still to this day do not accept December the 25th. Under pressure from Rome, some of the Eastern Catholic churches accepted Christmas feast, but they did so in the 16th century. So most of Eastern Europe, with the exception of a couple places, they didn't acknowledge Christmas at all until the 16th century. So it took them almost, 1500 years? Parliament of Scotland ends observance, Scotland, 1640. The Parliament of Scotland officially abolished the observance of Christmas in 1640, claiming that the church had been purged of all superstitious observation of days. It was not until 1958 that Christmas again became a Scottish public holiday. Now we're going to move into some of the holy days or not so holy days that may have influenced Christmas, or in fact, according to the Catholic Church, they did. This was the holy day that was existing on the exact same time as Christmas. It went on for 7 days, so it had a perfect overlap because it was a solstice party. This is called Saturnalia. Saturn was a god that was worshipped in Rome. The Greeks called him Kronos. When Saturnalia was practiced in Greece, it was called Chronalia. So the name didn't change very much. Here you can see what a typical Saturnalia would look like. Saturnalia was actually stopped in Rome in exchange for Christmas because Saturnalia was too debaucherous. People would be naked, people would be drunk, people would be sleeping with whoever. Basically, when Saturnalia started, there were no rules. What they would do is they would have a statue of Saturn. You can actually see it in the background. Saturn's the statue right over here. Saturn would have rope tied around his feet. And then what would happen is when Saturnalia would start, they would take the rope tied around Saturn's feet and remove it, and then the people could go around and be lewd and debaucherous and whatever they wanted to do. So there was a lot of public drunkenness. Public drunkenness was huge, a lot of eating, a lot of excess of pretty much everything. And people, it was like Mardi Gras. They would be having sex in the streets. So Saturnalia, it's a Roman festival dedicated to the Roman god Saturn, and it was actually felt throughout the whole Western world. Originally, it was celebrated on December the 17th. Saturnalia was extended first to 3 days and then eventually to 7 days. So people were having so much fun being drunk and ridiculous that 1 day wasn't enough. 3 days weren't enough. And by the end of it, eventually, I think it was the times of Aurelian, they had extended it to 7 days. Here's an image of, again, the festival of Saturn. And if you take a look, again, you can see the drunken revelry. I think the statue of the Saturn's back here. But either way, yeah, this person's half clothed. You can tell everyone's drinking. And then if you take a look at the date of the photo, it's 535 AD. So this carried on long after Christmas started. Saturnalia, what did people do? Well, people would feast in their homes. But the historian Livy notes that by 217 BC, there would also be a huge public feast at the oldest temple in Rome, the Temple of Saturn. Macrobius confirms this and says that the rowdy participants would spill out onto the street with participants shouting "Eo Saturnalia." So just like we would go Christmas caroling, they would go out and they would go singing. They would sing to Saturn. So today what we say is we say Merry Christmas. They would say Eo Saturnalia. One of the ways that you would say Saturn's name in the ancient world was by saying Eo. So for example, Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O. That was actually influenced from Saturn. So Eo Saturnalia, it's like saying Merry Christmas. That's where Merry Christmas came from. The ordinary, rigid, and conservative social restrictions of the Romans changed, for example. Masters served their slaves during a feast, and adults would serve children, and slaves were allowed to gamble. Okay, well, if you've worked in a big company before, this should kind of stand out. Every year, typically, large companies have Christmas parties, and during the Christmas party, what happens is you have the leaders dress up, typically in little Christmas sweaters, and then they serve their employees. So you can see this was ripped right from Saturnalia and exists live and well today. I know that a lot of people too, during their Christmas parties, they'll do gambling as well. So we had actually one at Blue Cross. It was a casino just a couple of years ago. But that's a really common theme. So you can see this first paragraph about Saturnalia, you can copy and paste that and stick that on Christmas because nothing's changed there. And the aristocracy, who usually wore conservative clothes, dressed in brightly colored fabrics such as red, purple, and gold. The outfit was called the synthesis, which meant to be put together. They would put together whatever clothes they wanted. So if you take a look here, these colored clothes, they'd have to be worn by the leadership, right? So your leaders would wear this really colorful, really standoutish kind of clothing, and then they would serve you. Well, it's the same thing today. Instead of wearing like purples and reds and gold, typically what happens, and I've seen this in a couple companies, your leadership will come around and they'll wear a Christmas sweater and they'll drop off Christmas candies or something or give you a greeting. This was something that happened at Blue Cross as well, where every year our leadership would come down dressed up in a crazy looking Christmas sweater and they would come down and greet every one of us.
The ones in Blue Cross South.
Yeah, except
that they forgot.
Except some of us who live in the not so popular buildings of the company. Saturnalia, originally taking place on a single day under the reign of Emperor Augustus, 63 BC to 14 BC. The event was extended to multiple days. By the time the Emperor Caligula ruled, Saturnalia lasted between 5 and 7 days, with a culmination often falling on December the 25th, around the time of the winter solstice. So Saturnalia went on for 7 days. On the final day, that's when everyone went all out. And the final day we'll get to in just a second. It was called Sigillaria. December 25th had added significance for the Romans as it was the birthday of the sun god Sol Invictus, a date appropriately close to the longest night of the year. So here we go again. We're looking at Saturnalia. We get that date, December the 25th again. We get all these different customs and traditions that overlap with Christmas. But again, it points us back to the worship of the sun. So Saturn was obviously a sun god. Mithra was a sun god. Sol was a sun god. We can see what was the popular type of worship in Rome. It was the worship of the sun. Sigillaria. Sigillaria was the name of the last day of Saturnalia, which was a time of gift giving. Ooh, this sounds familiar. So that would have been the 25th. That's the last day. In ancient Roman culture, sigillaria were pottery or wax figurines given as traditional gifts during the Saturnalia. These were sometimes hung in greenery as a form of decoration, and people would bring in holly and berries to honor Saturn. Well, it looks like we haven't given up with the holly wreath. In the dialogue of Macrobius' Saturnalia, the interlocutor, I can't pronounce that, Praetextitus, says that sigillaria were substitutes for the sacrificial victims of the primitive religious rituals. So if you look at some of the worship of Saturn in the old world, and he went by different names, another name for Saturn was Dagon, they used to actually offer human sacrifice. So one of the old ways they used to actually practice this solstice celebration, and this wasn't the solstice celebration everywhere that celebrated Saturn, it was just some areas. When areas lost what some of the meanings were behind some of the symbols, this is when human sacrifice came into play. What would happen is at the beginning of the year, which they would look at as in March, there'd be a sex ritual. The sex ritual would be an orgy. 9 months after March, you get December. December is when the babies from March that were the conception that happened in March, they'd be birthed in the winter during the solstice. So what would happen is on that period of time, some of the different cults that worship Saturn were actually taking their children and sacrificing them. They were taking the children and they were burning them in a fire, and that was the Yule fire. The other thing that was being confused here was the other side of the cult. They were actually taking mushrooms and they were cutting mushrooms from the ground and they were eating them, or they were drinking the juice from them and they were getting high. We've talked about that before. So it depends. Which worship of Saturn were you looking at? Were you looking at the worship of Saturn with wise men and sages that knew what all these symbols meant? Or were you looking at the worship of Saturn that had degenerated and people didn't know what the symbols meant anymore? Because the symbol of what they thought was human sacrifice was supposed to be popping the head off of a mushroom. We actually talked about that a little bit before. If you want more detail on that, definitely take a look at that episode I did on Pharmakia. On Pharmakia, I clearly explain exactly what the mushrooms are about and how this got mixed up with child sacrifice. So these are the sigularia. These are little things that they would give out. They were typically the deities that they would worship. As a matter of fact, we covered this deity here. This deity showed up when we were studying Pergamum. This was a god that was actually worshipped in Pergamum. So we can see here all these different gods that were worshipped in Rome. They're coming from Asia. And Asia is where we connect to Babylon, because Babylon was pretty much taking all this information through the Aryans, moving it towards the east, and the east being Asia. So this is how you had all this knowledge that came from Mesopotamia into Asia and then into Europe and Rome. Saturnalia, as late as the 8th century, church authorities complained that even people in Rome were still celebrating the old pagan customs associated with Saturnalia and with other winter holidays. So Christmas became officially recognized in 350. 354, it was mandatory if you were a Roman Catholic or just a member of the church in general, you had to observe it. But we can see that Saturnalia competed with it because it carried on in parts of Rome until the 8th century. So the blending of these two ideas are extremely likely, especially when we can see it wasn't just Saturnalia we can see pieces from. We can also see pieces from the cult of Mithra. Saturnalia, that existed closer to the days of before Christ, whereas Mithra was more popular in the days of Constantine. But when you look at these two, there's a lot of overlap between the two of them because they're both solar religions. Now we're going to move on to Yule. And if you take a look here, you can see this is the wreath you would typically put on your door. Notice on the inside, you see the 5-pointed star. What the Yule actually represents, or the wreath, represents, it represents the serpent eating its tail. So when you look at the zodiac pictures, sometimes you'll see the constellations, and sometimes around the 12 constellations, you'll see a serpent that's wrapped around that eats its tail. That is exactly what the wreath represents. If you take a look, remember we looked at the pagan wheel. This is the pagan wheel of the year. So these are all the pagan holy days. Obviously, if you live in different areas of the world, Yule will take on a different name. One of the names Yule takes on is actually called Lady Night. Samhain obviously has different names as well. Imbolc, you might call that Lupercalia. That was another name for it. So it just depends on which group of pagans you're dealing with. The divisions on this wheel will stay the same, but the names will substitute. But what's interesting here is we can see Yule. Under Yule, we have this symbol. It's called the triquetra. The triquetra, people have confused for a symbol of the Trinity. It's only a symbol of the Trinity if you're a pagan. If you look on the right-hand side here, here's a book called The Craft, a witch's book of the shadows. And notice here, the triquetra sets in the center as it does in the middle of the zodiac wheel. This is important. If you take a look at Yule, or Yuletide, it says, "May the light of the sun shine on your family this Yule season." How is this not sun worship? What happens every Yule season? If we take a look at this wheel, on December the 21st, the sun is going to die. It's going to sit on the horizon, and then 3 days later, it's going to take off and then carry on, and summer comes. Well, that's why Yuletide was a memory of the sun. It's the sun overcoming the cold. So if you have the cold part of the year and the warm part of the year, the way they used to break this down was you had the Holly King. The Holly King was one half of the year, and the Oak King was the other half of the year. Holly King obviously represents the parts of the years that are cold, and the Oak King represents the parts of the year that are warm. The pagans believed that at the solstice there would be a fight between the Holly King and the Oak King, and then they would switch, and then the year would either get colder or would get warmer. The very name by which Christmas is also known, Yule or Yule Day or the Yuletide season, is literally linked to its Babylonian origins. The word Yule in the ancient Chaldean language of Babylon is the name for an infant or a little child. Far and wide in the realms of ancient paganism, the birth of the Babylonian Queen of Heaven's son was celebrated at the time of midwinter. Remember, midwinter is the solstice. Midwinter is, it says right here, midwinter is another name for the winter solstice, and was December the 25th before the Roman shift in time. Okay, so we can see going all the way back to Babylon. If we use that Julian calendar and we mark the solstice as the 25th, this is nothing new. As a matter of fact, Yule means little child, and then what do we think about Christmas? Well, we think about children and giving them presents, but it wasn't talking about children and presents. It was talking about the birth of a child. However, when we take a look at what Yule is about, it's not the birth of a physical child, it's the birth of the sun. That's why may the light of the sun shine on your family this Yule season. It's when the sun takes off again. Part of the birth celebration of the original Babylonian Queen of Heaven, Semiramis, her son Tammuz, consisted of bringing in a Yule log on December the 25th. The Yule log symbolized Nimrod being cut down in the prime of his life and in the height of his power, then cut into pieces and burned. Unbeknownst to many, Christmas trees return us full circle to Christmas original's pagan roots and to the winter solstice birth of the celebration of the sun god. Throughout antiquity and even today, all pagan sun god birthdays were celebrated on the ancient winter solstice, December the 25th. So in the Old Testament, actually, this came up. On the left-hand side, this is called a pillar of Asherah. If you read through the Old Testament, you'll hear about the prophets finding these tree-looking like idols, and they would cut them down. And the pagans would decorate them. They put wreaths on them, they would dress them up, they would put gold on them, silver, all kinds of stuff. This is actually where the Christmas tree started. I'm going to go through the origins of the Christmas tree in just a moment, but I'm going to show you this is the earliest versions of the Christmas tree. So the Christmas tree is associated to Asherah. Asherah was a female, and what they would do is they would basically carve out from the tree to make it look like this voluptuous kind of an earth goddess. If you notice on top of her head, though, that looks like the exact same thing we saw on Mithra, the same thing we saw on Apollo, the same thing that we saw on Helios. She's got those solar rays on top of her head. In Jeremiah 10:2, it's speaking specifically to these idols that you're seeing. Thus saith the Lord, learn not the ways of the heathen, and do not be dismayed at the signs of heaven. So stop there for a second. The heathen were the people living in the outside nations of Israel. In the first sentence, it says, do not be dismayed by the signs of heaven. What's being alluded to here in Jeremiah is the idea that the reason that the people were doing these celebrations and traditions had something to do with something that was going on in the sky. And of course, the winter solstice, there is a lot going on in the sky. It says, for the heathen are dismayed at them, for the customs of the people are vain. For one cutteth a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with an axe. They deck it. Listen to the language. You deck the halls, right? They deck it with silver and with gold. They fasten it with nails and with hammers so it cannot move. They are upright as a palm tree, but they speak not. They must needs be born, because they cannot go. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do evil. Neither is it in them to do good. So here what we're seeing in Jeremiah, keep in mind, there's no Christmas, right? All we know is that there was competing religions going on in the world at the same time that we see the story of the Israelites. In the days of Jeremiah, we know there was the Queen of Heaven. And during the worship of the Queen of Heaven, they were also worshiping this god that was called Baal. What we're seeing here is we're seeing the description of what the people were doing in Jeremiah when they would cut down a tree and they would bring it in and they would decorate it. And then here we're seeing in Jeremiah, the word is don't do that. Don't copy them. They're copying something that has to do with signs in the heavens. And we can see that from the first sentence. And once we get to explaining exactly how sun worship works, you will see exactly why Jeremiah 10:2 is speaking about what's going on in regards to the zodiac. The first Christmas tree. First Christmas tree was put up in Strasbourg, Germany, 1605. So that's very late. If the Christmas tree was something associated to Christ's birth, it took them, almost 1,600 years to get that symbol in there. It's nowhere in the Bible. The only place we can find something similar is Jeremiah. The first Christmas tree. In 1419, a guild in Freiburg put up a tree decorated with apples, flour paste wafers, tinsel, and gingerbread. In paradise plays that were performed to celebrate the feast day of Adam and Eve, which fell on Christmas Eve. And a tree of knowledge was represented by an evergreen fir tree with apples tied to its branches. Okay, so here you can kind of see, if this was the first Christmas tree, the first Christmas tree is based on the tree inside of the Garden of Eden. And it wasn't the tree of life, it was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so they even put apples on the tree. So it's kind of interesting here that they've actually tied the Christmas tree to the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden. Flanders finds documentation of trees decorated with wool thread, straw, apples, nuts, and pretzels. Flanders says the first decorated indoor tree was recorded in 1605 in Strasbourg, decorated with roses, apples, wafers, other sweets, according to her research. And this came from Time magazine. The Royal Christmas Tree. This was illustrated in the London News in 1848. This is what caused most of North America actually to adopt a Christmas tree. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert and their children gathering around a Christmas tree, eyeing the presents underneath, published in the Illustrated London News in 1848. So basically what happened was you had the British, they put up this tree and they have this image go off into the London News. And then when other people had seen this, the next year they started to emulate what the Queen was doing. And so in Britain, they started to emulate what the Queen was doing, but they started to do it also in North America. Christmas in the United States. The premier women's magazine in America back then was called Godey's Lady's Book, a reprinted version of the image a couple years later as the Christmas tree. So the same image that they had published in the Illustrated London News in 1848, a couple years later made its way into a very popular North American magazine. The magazine was called Godey's Lady's Book. And then this is how Christmas started to be celebrated, or at least with a tree, in North America. In 1861, this custom made its way to England. So England was last. England was one of the last places to have Christmas trees. Oops. Christmas tree in England. Queen's Lodge, Windsor, 1800. The honor of establishing this tradition in the United Kingdom rightfully belongs to good Queen Charlotte, the German wife of George III, who set up the first known English tree at Queen's Lodge, Windsor in December 1800. So again, when we take a look at the birth of Christ, when we take a look at the Christmas tree, first off, we don't have a birth for Christ in the Bible. We don't have a time in regards to a season, and we definitely don't have a date. Some of the traditions, whether it be the wreath, whether it be even the food or the tree, we don't have any reason as to why we do it. There's no explanation that's coming for these decor in the Bible, but we do see that this is showing up in religions that worship the sun that surround the Roman Empire. So I understand that, for example, the Norse didn't have anything to do with the Romans, but the Norse and the Romans got their religion from the same place, which is from Iran. So the tree didn't show up until almost 1600 years, and that was probably 1300 years after they established the date in which they were going to say that Christ was born. So what we'll do is we'll pick up in about 15 minutes and we'll take a look at the worship of the sun. So if you look at a lot of old astrological wheels, you'll typically find the 12 zodiac houses. They might depict them slightly differently in regards to how they either do the symbol or how they either do the animal sign. But what's typically consistent is in the center of all of these wheels, you'll see a sun. Notice how you always see the sun's face sitting in the center of the wheel. Now, you'll probably say, well, that's because all of these signs go around the sun, the zodiac moves, and it's not actually the reason why the sun's in the center. Here's another depiction of another zodiac wheel. Again, you'll see the sun in the center, but you're not actually recognizing what that sun is, and that's what we're going to cover today. So here we have the zodiac houses, the 12 going around the sun, and that's pretty much what you're seeing when you look at these two different depictions here. Sun in the center, and then we see the zodiac signs going around it, but there's more to it. Notice here that we have the pagan wheel of the year we were looking at earlier. Again, this one's not broken down into 12, it's broken down into 8, unless you look on the inner ring. So around the outside, you're seeing the 8 because you see one cross for the solstice and the equinox, and then you have the cross that sits in between the solstice and equinox, like the quarter cross. So if you take a look here, you can count out their 8 holidays or 8 holy days. But also, if you notice here, you'll see here are the zodiac signs. So I got 3 here, 3 here, 3 here, 3 here. So I got 12. So I've got my 12 zodiac signs, and they sit inside of my 8 pagan holidays. And if you notice here, we've got that symbol called the triquetra. Triquetra is a symbol for the pagan trinity. So when we talk about, for example, Vishnu and Shiva and Brahma, that would be exactly what that represents. I understand this is Celtic, but it makes no difference because the same 3 that would be worshipped by the Celts would be the same 3 that would be worshipped by the Hindus. If you actually take a look, there's been so much intermingling with paganism and Christianity that people are just totally turned upside down. You'll notice here's a Holy Bible, King James Version, and on the front of it, you'll see the triquetra. These two do not go together. Triquetra is something associated to the pagan deity, which is associated to the worship of nature. Christians aren't worshiping a god of nature. They're worshiping the God who created nature, but they're not worshiping nature itself. When you see the symbol called the triquetra, that's going to point you back to the worship of the sun, the moon, the stars. So basically the worship of the things that are created. Also, you can see that this symbol, the triquetra, it shows up on witches' books. So it just goes to show you how confused the Christian community is when you can see the same symbols that show up with Wiccans and witchcraft showing up on the front of a Bible. It just goes to show you, like, when it comes to church history, people don't really know it. So here's what we're seeing when we see the triquetra. If you take a look on the far right, where it says rebus, that's called the alchemical wedding. This was something familiar to the alchemists, the Rosicrucians, anyone involved in the mysteries during the Renaissance. You can see that this is some kind of a conjoined twin. So you see a male on the left, you see a female on the right. The male is holding the compass, which draws a circle. The female is holding the builder's square, which draws a square. So we've got sun on the left, moon on the right, circle on the left, square on the right, and the two of them are joined together. If you look above their head, this is where things get interesting. Above their head, you'll notice that there's a symbol where it looks like a little crescent moon on top of a stick man. That's actually the symbol for Mercury. So what you're looking at here, if you understood what that symbol means, it means this is the androgynous deity. It is both male and female. So you can see the androgynous deity is standing upon the serpent, standing upon the dragon. But interestingly enough, in between their two heads, where that symbol for Mercury is, it's a 6-pointed star. The same 6-pointed star you would see the Jews with. And if you take a look actually going around where the compass and the square are, notice that the other 4 stars that are in the picture, they all have 6 sides. On the far left-hand side, you'll see the Baphomet. Now, when you look at the Baphomet and you look at the image on the right, you'd think they have no connection. They are the exact same image. They are hiding things in plain sight with images that look slightly different, but it's all the same religion. The androgynous deity on the left that was drawn by Eliphas Levi. Eliphas Levi drew this around probably the 1700s. This was drawn around the exact same time that you saw these alchemist symbols appear in Europe. These are the same thing. One may look scary because it looks like a goat, but they are the exact same thing. When we take a look at the Hindus, no different. You have to understand that the symbol on the left of the goat was actually drawn by Freemasons who took this information from Asia. So when we take a look in Asia, such as India, and we see that there's a similarity here where we see a combined Vishnu or Shiva and Shakti, you can see what the Baphomet really is. The Baphomet is just the female energy and the male energy pulled together when Shiva and Shakti become one. And then we see the same thing with the alchemical wedding. We see when the sun and moon come together, we get this third creature. That's the androgynous deity. So when you're taking a look at this triquetra, it's showing you 3 because it represents the sun and the moon and then the new thing that gets created when the sun and moon come together. So if you take a look on the left-hand side, here we've got the zodiac, but what's in the center? Instead of the sun, what do we see? It looks like Helios. It looks like Apollo. It looks like Mithra. So they weren't actually putting the sun in the center of the wheel. They were putting their god or goddess in the center of the wheel. And since, of course, it's androgynous, sometimes you see the god, sometimes you see the goddess. So now when you look in the future and you see the zodiac wheel, now when you see the sun in the center, you're going to realize the sun that sits in the center of the zodiac wheel is actually the androgynous deity that was worshipped throughout the ancient world. That's what it represents. So here we can see in Colossus in Rome, we see the male, and then we see Liberty, the female, same thing. As a matter of fact, if you take a look on the left-hand side, this was found in Israel. This is the Beth Alpha Synagogue. There was Helios, the Greek sun god, riding his four-horse chariot, the quadriga, right there in the middle of the zodiac. But it was featured in the center of the floor, right behind a mosaic of the Torah ark that was flanked by two menorahs. Below the Helios mosaic was an inscription thanking the good Jews who founded or contributed money to the synagogue. Okay, so let's take a look what's happening here. Over here, we know who this is. This is Helios, this is Apollo, this is Mithra, whatever name you want to give them. But this is that sun symbol that sits in the center of the zodiac. Well, we've got a problem. We've got the astrological wheel. Now, there's nothing pagan about the astrological wheel. God gave us the stars. So we're allowed to look at the stars and keep an eye on their positions. That's called the practice of astronomy. The practice of astrology is when you try to make decisions as if you're going to know the future based on the position of those stars. That's astrology. There's a big difference. Now, if you look in the center, here's the weird part. I'm not concerned about the wheel with the animals on the outside because the Jews could have used that for farming. For example, if the year starts in Aries, when Taurus comes, Taurus is the time of year when you take your bulls out to plow the field. There's nothing wrong with understanding the zodiac signs and using it for farming, using it for times of the year. But if you notice in the center, this is where the problem is. The center, we see a solar deity with rays coming from his head. And then what do we notice? Four horses. Well, that's Apollo, that's Helios. Now, Apollo or Helios specifically is where you get the word hell from. So for the Jews to have this inside of their synagogue, they're literally following the god of the abyss, which would have been Osiris. Here's another example. Sepphoris Synagogue, Israel. In one ancient synagogue excavated in 2000 in Sepphoris, Helios is transformed. Instead of his image there is only a sun disk driving the quadriga. It's almost as if the congregation was feeling a little guilty about having a picture of the sun god on the synagogue floor and alleviated their guilt somewhat by picturing only the sun itself driving its chariot instead of the face of the Greek god. So in other words, here we see in one synagogue, here's Helios. Here we see in another synagogue, here's Helios, but they just stripped off the face a bit. But you can still see the chariot and you can see the sun, so you know exactly what this is. As a matter of fact, if you look around it, it looks like they put the zodiac going around it as well. It gets worse though. If we take a look at the Chorazin synagogue, in another ancient synagogue at Chorazin, here's the head of Medusa. Medusa was a mythological female monster with snakes for hair. Looking at her would turn you into stone. Most people know the story of Medusa, but there's no reason in the world why the Jews should have this inside of their synagogues. Judges chapter 2, verse 12 to 13 can explain this though. And they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples that were around them, and bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. So they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth. Okay, so there were two gods they were worshiping here. So the Jews turned their back on the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they picked up a different one. They picked up two, according to the book of Judges. One is male, one is female. So Baal is the male, Ashtaroth is the female. If we look at Acts 7:43, it says, "You have taken up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Raphan, the idols you made to worship. Therefore, I will send you into exile beyond Babylon." Interesting thing here. We have tabernacle of Moloch, but here's the important part. The star of your god Raphan. What is the star of your god Raphan? We have to know what that is. If we look at Raphan or Remphan, it's Strong's 4481. It says that Remphan is the Saturn of later mythology. Oh, is that like the same Saturn that we had Saturnalia and Chronia from? Absolutely. Okay, so then Saturn, which we see connected to Christmas, showed up in the Old Testament as well in the book of Judges. They had worshipped this deity in the book of Judges. This is the talisman of Saturn. If you take a look at the talisman of Saturn, the one thing that should stand out is the six-pointed star with the bull's head inside of it. It says, on the other side is engraved a bull's head enclosed in a six-pointed star and surrounded by the letters composed of the name Orpheus, the planetary genius of Saturn, according to the alphabet of the Magi. So wait a minute, who are the Magi? Didn't the Magi come when Christ was born? They sure did. So where did they come from? They came from the east. What was east of Jerusalem? Well, Babylon, Iran. Okay. So the Magi came from came from Babylon, made their way towards the west, and then made their way into Jerusalem, and then eventually made their way to see Christ. What's interesting here is when you think about the Magi we've studied in the past, and we found out the Magi, there's a connection to the word rabbi. And we had the connection rabbi go to Rab Meg. And Rab Meg brought us right back to this word chief as in like a chief priest. It looks like what happened here was we have this symbol of a bull and the six-pointed star, and it has something to do with the Magi. Now, considering that the word rabbi is nowhere in the Bible, and then we see the Jews practicing a different religion than the one that was being practiced by the apostles, are you starting to limit it down in regards to what religion was competing in Rome? Here's the Jewish flag. Now, interestingly enough, this star is supposed to be associated to Moloch. This star is supposed to be associated to Saturn and Remphan. Well, that's the star that's on the Jewish flag. Leviticus 20:2 says, tell the Israelites, any Israelite or foreigner living in Israel who gives any of his children to Moloch must be put to death. The people of the land are to stone him. Okay, so Moloch is actually this deity, this bull god that we see in the middle of the star, and also this statue that we saw coming from Phoenicia. In Deuteronomy 12:21, we saw exactly what those people did. It said, you must not worship the Lord your God in this way, because they practice for their gods every abomination which the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods. Okay, so we saw that there was a connection to a sun god that was worshipped around Christmas. We saw that Saturn was worshipped in the Old Testament, but also before Christ and after Christ. We saw that when the worship of Saturn went into a degenerative form, they were actually killing children. When the worship of Saturn was in its pristine form, the symbol of the child death or the infant death or the Yule death was actually the death of a mushroom. So here we can see in Deuteronomy, this must have been when the Israelites learned a degenerated form of the worship of Saturn, because they aren't eating mushrooms and getting high. Here we see them actually giving their children to an idol. So when we take a look at this star, the star of Remphan, because that's what it is, the star of Remphan has 6 points on the outside and 6 points on the inside. So 6 inner points and 6 outer points. Well, if you have 6 inner points and 6 outer points, what do you really have? You have your 12 zodiac houses. So this star then, the star of Remphan, you can see how this is connecting now to the sky, because this is actually a symbol for the zodiac houses. This is also a symbol for the Hindu god Shiva. If this was a Jewish symbol, this would not show up in India long before David ever existed. When we look at this as Shiva, we can see this as CERN. And if you notice here, Shiva is standing on top of a person who's reaching out on the ground. Well, normally what we would see is what? We would see a double-headed individual. Let's go back actually just to bring it up so you can see. Look at Rebus. We've got 2 heads, and of the 2 heads, what do we see? Standing on top of the serpent. As a matter of fact, I'll show you how deep this goes. If I go to Virgin Mary, here's the image of the Virgin Mary. Virgin Mary up top, serpent beneath her feet. It's all the same image. You're just seeing it depicted in different ways. Again, Mary on the top, serpent beneath. Here we have androgyne on the top, serpent beneath. And then when we go back forward to where we were, we have the androgyne, but you're not seeing the 2 heads, and then you're seeing the serpent underneath. Let me point something else out though. If this is an androgyne, how could you figure it out? Well, an androgyne would have to be both male and female, so both mixed together. Now, I can't really tell by looking whether this is more masculine or more feminine looking, but I will tell you this. I see 4 arms. 4 arms means 2 pairs. So there's 2 deities here merged together. And if you look on the outside, you'll see a ring of fire. like Johnny Cash. Now you know where he got the song from. The ring of fire actually represents the opposite of what this deity is. So if the moon is on the inside, then the sun sits on the outside. So then you can see the sun and moon brought together. So this is the androgynous deity. So these are all one and the same. So Shiva and Shakti, when they come together, it's like looking at the yin and yang, or the sun and moon, or the 6 and 9, or summer and winter, or heaven and earth coming together. The pagans talked about a sky god and a ground goddess, and sometimes it was inverted. But of course, if heaven and earth come together, that's God and goddess becoming one inside of the initiate, the person who was going through all these different rituals to become a priest. You'll see here that one aspect was associated to the male, one aspect was associated to the female. Remember, we talked about the tree of knowledge of good and evil representing the spinal cord, and we can see the third eye sits in between the two eyes, and there we can see wings and a serpent's head. But when we see Shiva and Shakti representing the two hemispheres of the brain, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, we have the masculine, the feminine, we've got fire, and we've got water. Fire is symbolized by an upward triangle, water is symbolized by a downward triangle. So in other words, fire and water come together inside of the individual, and they have a change in their consciousness. In Egypt, it was no different because remember, we're dealing with the same religion. It just spread across the world. So in Egypt, it looked like this. Instead of having Shiva and Shakti, you had the eye of Ra and you had the eye of Thoth. Thoth represented the moon, Ra represented the sun. The right eye was the eye of the sun, the left eye was the eye of the moon. If I was a Hindu, I would say Shiva and Shakti. I would say Shiva is your masculine fire figure, so he represents the sun, he represents the heavens. And then Shakti is your feminine water symbol, which represents the moon, which represents your earth. So I've got sky god and ground goddess. And when I take the sky god and ground goddess and put them together, what do I get? I get the child. This is what Christmas is about. This is the father, this is the mother, together I get the child. This is Santa, this is Rudolph. Why would Shakti be Rudolph? Because the moon has a pair of horns. The moon itself, actually, when you're looking from the hemisphere of when you're looking for Mesopotamia, if I go moon, the closer you are to the equator, the more the moon looks horizontal. So of course, when you're looking at the moon from the equator, it looks like a pair of animal horns or devil horns. And so going back here, if we have Shakti, which represents the moon, she would be the horns. That would be your reindeer. If you look at the red one would be Shiva. That would be your sun god. That would be Santa. This is Santa and Rudolph. These are the two together. That's the sun and the moon. So again, this is all talking about the idea of the heavens coming down and then touching the earth. So we're on the earth, heavens are above. The solar gods were always depicted above, lunar depicted below. Why? Because if I use the horizon and I draw a line across the horizon, everything above the horizon is going to be bright. Everything below the horizon is going to be dark. So night and day. So when you take a look at this, now you can see where the star really comes from. If you look at the top point, Saturn, then we've got on the left, Mars, Jupiter on the right, Mercury, Venus, Moon, Sun in the center. That's what the six-pointed star is. The six-pointed star is actually showing you the 5 planets that you could see from the Earth plus the Sun and the Moon. That gives you your 7. 6 points and the Sun, right? So Sun, Moon, plus the 5 planets they could see from the ground thousands of years ago. That's actually where the star comes from. So to call this the Star of David, you'd have to say that David would be some kind of a zodiac worshiper. They used to call this in Hebrew the Akum. The people who followed the zodiac, followed the horoscope, and thought that they could predict things, and they followed the six-pointed star, they were called the Akum, which means zodiac worshippers.
Those are also the days of the week.
And yeah, they're also the days of the week, because of course the Romans, you can clearly tell, like this has been permeating through our history for thousands of years, because this was surrounding the Jews. It obviously made its way to Rome, because your days of the week are actually based on what you're looking at right here. So if I go with moon, moon is Monday. Monday, moon, or lundi. Lundi, luna. That's French. That's French for moon. And then if I take a look, what's the next day? So Monday, then Tuesday. Tuesday in Latin, Mardi. Mardi has to do with Mars. That's Tuesday. And then Wednesday or Woden's Day or Mercredi in French is Mercury. Woden and Mercury are the same thing. If I take a look over here where Jupiter is, Thursday or Thor's Day, and we have the Norse god Thor, that's Jupiter. And then Venus, Aphrodite, she was called Freya or Friday or Freitag in German. So you're seeing your 5 days of, or your 7 days of the week. So you got your 5 planets for your 5 days, and your sun and moon are your Sunday and your Monday. So everything inside of our culture is actually based around the worship of the sun, the moon, and the stars. And otherwise, we would just have 7 days in the week that were numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So if we take a look, notice on the very center of the 6-pointed star, remember, this came from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is what we said the Christmas tree was. In the center of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the sun is at the center. Well, in the center of the 6-pointed star, the sun was in the center as the alchemical symbol. Well, when we look at the zodiac wheel, what are we seeing? We see a sun over here, but we also see a sun over here. So what does this sun in the center represent? Mithra, Helios, Sol Invictus, the list goes on. But of course, it translates over into the Hindu cosmology because, of course, Hinduism and the things that were going on in Rome and then what was going on in the latter parts of Europe in the Norse times, this is all coming from Iran. And so, of course, we can take all these points and overlap them with the Hindu with the Hindu deities, because, of course, if you do your research, you'll find out Brahma is Saturn. So all you're doing is you're just basically substituting a name for another name because, of course, it moved geographically. But Saturn is Saturn. Brahma is Saturn. I mean, to the Romans, he would be Saturn. To the Hindus, he'd be Brahma. To the Greeks, he'd be Kronos. To the, what's another popular name? Phoenicians, the Canaanites in the Bible, Dagon was a name that came up. Moloch. The Jews adopted star worship like India and Babylon, where it originated. And of course, once you read the Old Testament, there are several verses to explain where it happened, because we already saw Book of Judges. They're worshiping both Baal and Ashtaroth. Now, who's Ashtaroth? Well, Ashtaroth is Mother Earth. Judges 2:12-13. Let's read it again. And they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them. So remember, they learned this from the nations that were around them. Well, take a look. Where is Israel? What are the nations that are around it? Did they worship these same gods in the surrounding nations? Was Mithra worshipped surrounding Israel? Well, it came from Iran. What about Zeus? What about Saturn? Where do they all come from? We can see that these all came from places that surrounded Israel. So clearly in Judges, we're seeing that what later became religions of the Romans and the Greeks were obviously adopted from Asia, and this was taken by the Jews as well. It says, so they forsook the Lord, and they served Baal and Ashtaroth. Let's figure out who exactly Baal is first. Baal, probably Baal, was a title and honorific meaning owner or lord in Northwest Semitic languages. Look at the last piece here. Scholars previously associated the theonym with solar cults. Okay, so Baal's the sun god. Baal's the solar god. His name just means Lord. Lord isn't a name. Lord is a title. So there could be other deities that were all called Baal. But take a look at this. Look at the symbol for Baal. The symbol for Baal is a bull. Well, okay, so let me get this straight. Does that mean that when they were serving Moloch, they were serving Baal? Yes, it's the same thing. And if you take a look actually over here, this helps clarify it. Ashtaroth is also Asherah. It's the same thing. So here we can see in Judges, when you read in Judges, they served Baal and Ashtaroth, or they served Moloch and Asherah. Another Greek equivalent we can see here is Zeus. So when we talk about Zeus, we said that Zeus shows up in the last book of the Bible. He's in the book of Revelations, but he's identified as Satan. Well, isn't that interesting? The symbol that's on the flag of the Jews is actually the symbol that Christ had denoted as being satanic. Now, how does that all fit? Pretty easily, because if you know your Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, most of the Jews did not accept Christ. The Sadducees did not accept Christ. The Pharisees did not accept Christ. So now what we're doing is we're looking at their religion. We're looking at the religion which was the opposition to what the Christian apostles were dealing with. they had to go up against this. It was in the Old Testament. It never died. It carried on. And instead of being called Baal, Moloch, or Baal in general, the name switched to Jupiter. So this is how far back it goes. If I go right back to ancient Assyria, I can see Shamash, Sin, and Nana. Well, here's the interesting part. Look at Shemesh. Shemesh is the sun god. Now, the interesting part about Shemesh is actually the combination of Inanna and Sin put together. So the same way we looked at the Hindu Trimurti, the three deities, what we're looking at here is if we take Inanna and we put Sin and we put the two together, we get their child, and their child is Shamash. Now, who's Shamash? We've already read about it. We read about it in Genesis. When we did our Bible studies on Wednesday, we learned that Shamash was the deity of Lot's children. So Lot was the one who wasn't supposed to survive in Sodom and Gomorrah. The whole place was supposed to be destroyed. His daughters had sex with him, and they had two children. Lot's two children, which he wasn't supposed to have, one was called Ben-Ami. Ben-Ami were the Ammonites in the Bible. And then the other child was Moab, and Moab were the Moabites in the Bible. And so the god Shamash was actually the god of both of these children. And so here we can see there is a direct connection to the children of Lot and the god they worshipped and what Israel started to worship later in their history, which they called Baal. So Baal is a sun god. If we look at the Beth Sherim catacombs, now remember when we looked at Baal, look, it says the Greek equivalent, what is it? It's Zeus. Okay, so look at this. The catacombs are filled with Jewish symbols. It also has an imposing engraved sarcophagus featuring Leda and the swan. In Greek mythology, the swan is the form that Zeus took so that he might seduce or rape the king's daughter, the beautiful Leda. Okay, so this is the interesting. So first we've got Medusa, then we've got Helios, and now we've got the Greek Zeus. The Jews, obviously in Israel, went as apostate as it gets because you can see that tons of their synagogue are filled with symbols that go back to sun worship. If we go to St. Peter's in Rome, though, it's no different. So if we look at the Vatican, here is a picture of quote-unquote Jesus. But if you take a look at his head, you can tell that's not Jesus. That's Helios. Jesus wasn't right. Jesus rode on a donkey, not four fine-looking horses with a chariot. If you know the Song of Susanna, you'll know that that period of time, especially if you've studied around the times of the Passover and the resurrection, any details surrounding the resurrection, you will see when Christ went out and he rode specifically on a colt. It was a donkey, not the horses. So again, whether we look in terms of Judaism, or we take a look at Rome before Christ, or we take a look at Rome after Christ, what do we keep seeing? All of these areas are worshiping some kind of a sun god. So what would the odds be of having all of a sudden sun worship integrate with the church when you can see that it's coming from both Catholicism and it's also coming from Israel? We've just shown in two different areas, Catholicism and Israel, we both have this solar god worship. So it's quite likely it got pulled in from there. We have the god Mithra. Now notice here, if this is Christ with his four horses, well, here's Mithra with his four horses. What were they doing? They were trying to blend together Christ, who is the Son of God, with a sun god. So we've got Christ, the Son of God, versus the pagan sun gods. Here's Helios, more of the same thing. Here's his four horses. Here's Apollo, more of the same thing. And of course, remember, we saw both Apollo and Helios inside of Jewish synagogues. And so, of course, if we take a look here, here's the one inside the Jewish synagogue. And what did we say? We said that the four horses being pulled by the sun god in the center is what they switched to be the sun symbol in the middle of the zodiac. So really, you're not looking at the sun, you're looking at the sun god every time you look at the astrological wheel and the sun that sits in the center. So this is really what you're looking at. Here's Helios, you're looking at him right now. Here's Apollo, you're looking at him right here now. Here's Sol Invictus, you're looking at him right now. You're looking at the unconquerable sun. Since, of course, the days get shorter and longer and it gets warmer and colder, the sun, every time it would defeat the cold, it becomes the unconquerable sun. It's born again. That's why the birth of Christ is in the winter. It's when the sun is taking birth. Because, of course, what happened was an amalgamating of pagan ideas and Christian ideas. If we take a look, we know the sun rises in the east and then it sets in the west. So here's how the sun moves. We've got the equator, and then the sun moves up and down the equator, and this is how we get our 4 seasons. The sun just continually keeps going in this loop over and over and over again, and as it goes up and down, we go through our 4 seasons. This is why, for example, you'll see Australia is cold for half the year, which is different than North America, or the northern hemisphere. So this path that it's going on, once it reaches its high point, that's the summer solstice. Once it reaches its low point, that's the winter solstice. So what's going on here is we're having a celebration that's occurring directly on the winter solstice. So when the sun is at its lowest, when the sun is dying, and then if you take a look over here in the spring, what's going on is the spring, you see the sun coming above the equator. When the sun came above the equator, they said it resurrected, right? Because it came above the equator. So the sun dies down here, and then it rebirths, and then it comes back to life again. And as it costs March the 21st is the equinox. That was the resurrection. So what they've done is they've taken Christ the person, and they've made Christ the person into some kind of a natural phenomenon. Now, if we take a look again at the motions of the sun, we draw the equator. Now we're going to draw the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. So the sun hits the Tropic of Cancer, gets cool in the south, and then when it hits the north, it gets cool in the, when it hits the south, it gets cool in the north. And this is the cycle that keeps going on. So Cancer was a crab, Capricorn was a goat. So what we see is we keep going through the 4 seasons. So we start off, let's say we start off right now with the spring equinox. So we'll start off with the spring equinox. That's the beginning of the year. That happens in Aries. And then from the spring equinox, we go to the summer, and then to the winter solstice, and then we go to the autumn equinox. So the sun moves, if you've noticed, like a snake. The sun moves in an S, just like a serpent. Every December the 21st, the sun would die at the solstice. The sun would lay dead on the horizon for 3 days, starting on the 21st. And then as we reached the 24th and the 25th, the sun was born again on December the 25th, and then the sun takes off. This is what solar worship is all about. This is why all their holy days fall along the equinox and the solstices. This is where you're getting the symbol of the cross from. The cross is actually the zodiacal cross, and the zodiacal cross made the sun cross. So if you've seen this symbol before, this has to do with the birth and the death of the sun. If you follow the sun and worship the sun and think that the sun is God, well, then this symbol should mean something to you. Otherwise, this symbol is just more pagan nonsense. If we take a look at Pope Francis, though, for whatever reason, we see that the popes, when they sign their name, and this isn't just Francis, the prior pope did it as well, they put a cross inside of the O. Well, the cross inside of the O is a zodiacal cross. So I have to ask the question, are the Catholics actually celebrating the birth and resurrection of Christ, or are we actually celebrating the birth and resurrection of the sun? If we take a look, remember, this is our pagan wheel. We've got Yule, Litha, Mabon, Ostara. That's our 4 points where we have Libra, Aries, Capricorn, and Cancer. So Capricorn is Yule. Cancer is down in Litha. This is where we're getting the solar cross from. We draw the equinox, we draw the solstices. This is where the cross comes from in the circle. If you see the symbol is not Christian. The symbol is pagan, because this symbol is totally associated to watching the times of the year and worshiping things based on the times of the year. So if you look at it from this perspective, we see that star in the center. Remember, the upward triangle is the sun. The downward triangle is the moon. This is mother and father. This is heaven and earth. This is circle and square. When the circle and square come together, that's when we're getting the solar cross. That's when we're getting the child. That's when we're getting Shamash. This is also known as Odin's solar cross. Now, Odin was a Norse god. I'm sure everyone knows Odin, Balder, Frigga. These are pagan deities. These are Norse deities that came from Iran. Now, if we can see that the Iranians are using a symbol that shows up within the church, either the Iranians are wrong or the church is wrong. But since we actually know what the symbol means now, we know that this symbol represents the sun on top of the equinox and the solstices. Well, we know that Christ didn't tell us to worship the seasons. We also know that Christ gave us different timings for our holy days than these holy days that are on the solstice and equinox. As a matter of fact, if you go through the 9 holy days, there are none of the 9 holy days falling on the solstice or equinox. That was something the pagans did. They're close, but they're not on the solstice and equinox. The solar cross was also called the solar cross of Ashur. Ashur shows up in the Old Testament. Ashur shows up when you're reading about Assyria. As a matter of fact, the Assyrians had a god that was called Ashur. So if you're trying to figure out how do they get this symbol, here's another answer. We know that there was an Assyrian captivity and a Babylonian captivity. And if we can see these symbols showing up in both Babylon and Assyria, there is no reason why we can't understand how they adopted them. They lived there. Here's the stele of Ur-Nammu. On the stele of Ur-Nammu, you'll see the solar cross of Assur again. Looks a little bit different, but you can tell it's the exact same thing. As a matter of fact, you can look at Islamic mosques and you'll see the same symbol show up. This character on the stele of Nammu, this is called Sin Nana. Now, the reason that's interesting is because when we look back a couple slides, we saw the relationship between the father, the mother, and the child in Mesopotamia was known as Sin, Inanna, and Shamash. Here's the solar cross of Assur again. If we take a look, we can see it's slightly different. So this was the original photo here, but we can still see it. We can see the wings are being represented by the crescent moon. And then we can see the centerpiece here where the cross is. The centerpiece with the cross is still actually there. So we can see the cross. So we've got the cross and we've got the crescent moon. They just changed the crescent moon to wings. If we take a look over here, here's a little bit later in time. Here we can tell that the cross has been changed into a little man. So this is Assur. And we can see him flying in some kind of a ship here. And notice here that he's got this archer's bow. Now here's the reason why this is important. We're trying to identify the fact that Satanism has actually taken over the church. When we use the word Satanism, everyone thinks the word evil and demons and craziness. That's not the case. Satan in the Bible, when you read about it, he masquerades as an angel of light. Another thing we know about Satan from the book of Ephesians is you have to wear the armor of God because Satan will fire his fiery darts at you. Now remember, these are all sun gods. This is a solar cross. So if this is a sun god, notice how he's holding a bow and arrow. In the Bible, it said that Satan would throw his fiery darts. Well, I would assume that a sun holding a bow and arrow would probably shoot off at least bows and arrows. I mean, arrows that would have fires on. He would at least shoot out flaming arrows. Here's the winged sun disk, just to show you how often you've seen this and not recognized it. This obviously entered Egypt. This should look recognizable. As a matter of fact, if you've ever been to the Washington Monument, this exact symbol right here on the bottom is inside of the Washington Monument. And of course, Washington himself was a Mason. We've studied Masonry and we saw huge connections to sun worship. Here's the winged disc again. As a matter of fact, you can find it in Mexico. You can find it in Samaria. You can find it in Assyria. You can find it in Egypt. And the list actually goes on. But again, this is all based on what? The solar cross. So in other words, when the sun sits on top of the equinox and the solstice. Now, if we take a look here, we see something interesting. On the right, we see our typical depictions of Christ, but look at the top. Here's the moon. Here's the sun. Why do they add those? And if you'll notice on the top, it says INRI. But if I look over here, this is a double-headed bird, and it says INRI. And then over here, I've got a pelican. And it looks like the pelican is actually pecking itself and then feeding its babies by feeding the babies itself. And again, INRI. INRI is Iusus Nazarenus Rex Eudorum, which means Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Okay, the first picture, aside from the sun and the moon, sure. Why? I get why it says Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. That was in the Bible. What I don't understand is why is a pelican and why is a double-headed bird being depicted with INRI? Is the bird being called King of the Jews? Is this double-headed bird here, the phoenix, being called King of the Jews? Do we have two different Christs that are being worshipped in the world here? Could it be possible that there is a Christ being represented as the sun and the sky, that people are worshiping and depicting as these different birds. And then there's the actual Son, the Son of God, who the physical man who died on the cross. Is this what we're seeing? Let's find out. So we've got our solar cross. We said our solar cross is the sun sitting in the middle of the equinox and the solstices. Instead of Jesus being the Son of God, what we can see happen in Rome was Jesus was merged with the Son as the Son, S-U-N, of God. So, of course, the pagans, this is how they came up with reincarnation. Every time you would see the sun go around the wheel and start all over again, since they had depicted all of their gods as the sun, since the sun dies and then it returns, where do you think reincarnation came from? They figured that since the individual has a solar plexus, and the solar plexus is in the body, and that solar obviously is the place where they thought the heart chakra was, the solar chakra, the heart chakra, the sun chakra. The sun chakra sits in the solar plexus. And so what they did was they said, since there's a sun on the outside, there's a sun on the inside. And since the sun on the outside rises and falls and rises again, the sun on the inside will rise and fall and rise again. And this is how they came up with their doctrines of reincarnation. By making the God into the sun and then making the person into the sun as well. The sun is God, they are God. Therefore, since the sun resurrects, they will also resurrect. Remember what the Catholic Church said. This is not just my own imagination. They were the ones who brought this. They said that the theory held by the majority, and this is talking about obviously the Christ's birth, the theory held by the majority is known as the history of religions hypothesis. It is, in its more conservative form, this theory suggests the origins of the Nativity Feast. So right here, the origins of Christmas, the origins of the Nativity Feast may be found in a series of striking parallels between the heliocentric, meaning sun-centered, religion of the late Roman Empire and the Christmas feast. And then we already outlined the fact that December the 25th was the winter solstice, which is when these heliocentric religious feasts happened. So there's no coincidence that you're seeing all this overlap with Jesus and the sun. And the reason is because there was another religion competing with Christianity at the exact same time and before Christianity existed, as well as after. And we can see how all those pieces got merged together. Christmas isn't one holiday. It's actually the amalgamation of several different solar worship holidays pulled together. So we can see aspects that are familiar with Mithra. Again, we can see Helios sits in the center, which is Mithra, which is the sun. So Christmas is really the celebration of the birth of the sun in the winter. The surrounding nations worship the sun and the moon. During the early years of the church, Christianity was blended with the worship of the sun, as it was the religion that existed both before Christ and followed all the way up to 800 AD. So we know that with Saturnalia. Now that we take a look, knowing what the solar cross is, take a look behind Christ's head. Perhaps some of these artists weren't depicting what you think they were depicting, because keep in mind, a lot of these frescoes and a lot of the stuff that was sculpted was done by people like Da Vinci and Michelangelo. Well, both of which, they were in the solar cult. We've studied that actually. We know that Da Vinci was in the mysteries because the Rosicrucians say that he was. And we know Michelangelo was as well because he was actually hiding parts of the body in his artwork and then depicting them in the sky as well. So he was showing a relationship between the heavens and the earth. So here we can see that the Christ that's being depicted in these pictures by these artists, this isn't Jesus at all. This is the sun. And we can tell because we can actually see the solar cross behind his head. As a matter of fact, that hand symbol he's making, a lot of people don't know what this means. They'll say, oh, that's the sign of benediction. That's this three-fingered hand sign right here. No, that's not the sign of the benediction. That's the sign of the Trinity. And the Trinity, or the Trimurti, or the Triquetra, which is what we saw with the Celts, wasn't associated to Christ, but it was associated to the worship of the natural phenomena that happened between the sun, the moon, the earth, and the stars. So many people have tried to explain this. A lot of people have tried to actually destroy the faith of Christians by telling them that, hey, you guys, you're not worshiping Jesus as a man, you're worshiping the sun in the sky. And the Jesus of the Christians is no different than Osiris, is no different than Dionysus, no different than Helios, no different than Apollo. You can see the problem here. When you teach your children that Jesus was born on December the 25th, what do you make him overlap with? Well, you make him overlap with all the sun worship festivals, because all the sun worship festivals happened on the solstice. Now we know, because we've studied it, there is nowhere in the Bible to say that Jesus was born during the solstice. We don't even know the season he was born in, but we can guess that it was in the winter. But the interesting thing is, by telling everyone that Christ was born on December the 25th, what harm are you doing? Well, the harm is you're replacing Christ for the sun. So the interesting thing is, it said in the book of Ezekiel, it said, in the future, what would happen? It said in the future, people would be worshiping the sun. And if you remember back from the book of Ezekiel, I told you, I said that, remember Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol? It was based on the Ezekiel and the 3 visions he had. Well, it was the final vision in Ezekiel where Ezekiel realized that people in the future would be worshiping the sun. Well, isn't it funny that we associate Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol to the book of Ezekiel? Ezekiel's warning you about the sun, but yet they're pushing you towards the sun. It's funny how that all kind of worked out like that. So here's Freemasonry. Here's their emblem of the compass and square. Should make more sense now. When you look at the compass draws a circle. What is the circle? Well, that's the sun. That's why they put the sun on the top of the compass. And then the builder's square, well, if the builder's square is on the bottom, it probably represents the earth. So we've got the heavens with the sun on the top. We've got the earth on the bottom. So we've got the circle in the sky and the square on the ground, or the builder's circle, or the builder's, the compass in the sky and the builder's square on the ground. So you can see how all these things connect together. This is all talking about your father sky, which is Jupiter, which is Zeus, and then your mother earth, which is the builder's square. Again, here's another fresco. Clearly you can tell the sun is a very important symbol within Freemasonry. The sun, the universal deity. So remember, I read this off the CIA's website. The CIA is totally aware that most of your religions are all pointing back to the same thing, either solar or lunar. It says the adoration of the sun was one of the earliest and most natural forms of religious expression. Complex modern theologies are merely involvements and amplifications of a simple aboriginal belief. The primitive mind, recognizing the beneficent power of the solar orb, adored it as the proxy of the supreme deity. Okay, we already saw that. We saw that lots of cultures adored the sun as the supreme deity. Concerning the origin of sun worship, Albert Pike makes the following concise statement. To them, the Aboriginal peoples, he, the sun, was the innate fire of the bodies of nature, author of life, heat, ignition. He was to them efficient cause of all generation, for without him there was no movement, no existence, no form. He was to them immense, indivisible, imperishable, and everywhere present. It was their need of light and his creative energy that was felt by all men, and nothing was more fearful to them than his absence. Now here's the important part. His beneficent influences caused his identification with the principle of good and the Brahma of the Hindus and the Mithras of the Persians, Atham, Amun, Pitha, Osiris of the Egyptians, Bel of the Chaldeans, Adonai of the Phoenicians, Apollo of the Greeks. So they've given us a lot of help here. Here it actually tells you, we can see that Apollo is the same thing as Bel. Well, Bel is Baal, and Baal we've already identified as Zeus. And then we go over here, we've got Osiris. Well, that's the Egyptian god. Haven't you noticed? Oh, Mithra. We've got Mithra over here too. Are you starting to notice here all these names that I'm bringing up as sun gods? They all seem to have the same imagery when I show you their symbols. And then here again, we see this in mystic masonry. Again, it will be urged there is no other name given under heaven or amongst men whereby they can be saved. But this is the ineffable name which every master is to possess, and the salvation and perfection are synonymous. Now here's the important part. It has also been shown that every act in the drama and the life of Jesus and every quality assigned to Christ is to be found in the life of Krishna and in the legend of all the sun gods from the remotest antiquity. So what is Freemasonry teaching its members? It's teaching that Jesus Christ is the sun. You just read it. I showed you using the pagan calendar how that sun in the center had the 4 horses, which means it's Apollo, it's Mithra, it's all those things. We just read from the CIA's website a couple of the different names of the sun. Here we're seeing more confirmation again that people literally worship the sun as if it was a deity. And the problem is that if Christians continue to identify December 25th as Christmas, the birth of Christ, they're going to actually end up worshiping the gods of Rome, the gods that Israel are worshiping. You're going to worship something that came from Asia. So instead of being the Son of God, he was merged with the Son as the Son of God. So when we look at Christmas, Christmas is not like it's just one, civilization's idea. It's an amalgamation of all these different sun gods. So I could pull some stuff from Greece, I could pull some stuff from Asia, I could pull some stuff from India. You're going to find that all of those things show up in Christmas. I'll just show you a couple. So if we look at the Christmas wreath itself, it's the serpent eating its tail. That's all it's ever. That's all it was. There's lots of books actually that articulate this. I'm sorry I didn't get a quote for you, but this is pretty common knowledge. The Ouroboros, Saturn, right? The serpent eating its tail, that was always a symbol that was denoted by the wreath. As a matter of fact, when we took a look, we saw that the Wiccans, or the Celts with their Yule festival, they put the wreath on their door. But the Celts, we know, are the Galatians, and the Galatians in the Bible had different gods. How about the turkey? Why do we eat turkey every Christmas? So also the Christmas goose. In Egypt, the goose was the favorite offering to Osiris, and it could not be eaten except in the depth of winter. Juvenal, the Roman poet, says that Osiris, if offended, could be pacified only by a large goose and a thin cake. At Rome, it was by the cackling of the sacred geese of Juno. So actually, as a matter of fact, if you take a look at the month of June, June gets its name from Juno. So again, we're seeing this constant theme of taking the months, taking the zodiac houses, and then naming them after their gods. So sacred geese of Juno kept in the capital, that the city was saved from the night attack of the Gauls. But Juno was another form of the Queen of Heaven and the mother of the child. Okay, so Juno is mom, and then we have child. Child is the sun god. So when we're looking at this birth of Christ at the solstice, what we're really looking at is we're looking at the Queen of Heaven and the Queen of Heaven's child. So if we look at the book of Jeremiah, we figure out the Queen of Heaven isn't God's wife. The Queen of Heaven is a counterfeit god that is competing with the God of Israel. And as a matter of fact, the women are told in the book of Jeremiah, stop worshiping the Queen of Heaven, and they refused. By why was the goose thus sacred to these deities? A symbolical meaning was attached to this bird. The goose, says Wilkinson, signified in hieroglyphics a child or a son. This is interesting because, of course, we just looked at Yule, and Yule came from Chaldea, and we know the Egyptians grabbed their stuff from Chaldea as well. Well, Yule means little child. So here we can see that the hieroglyph for the goose represents a little child. It was chosen to denote a son from its love to its young, being always ready to give itself up in chasseur. Okay, so look at this. Here we can see this symbol where this goose, or this geese, it gives up its own life for the life of its children, right? Well, where's that coming from? We just saw this. When we were taking a look a couple seconds ago, we saw INRI. Here's a pelican, and the pelican is doing what? The pelican is eating itself to feed its children. So who is this? Well, we can tell it's the exact same thing that we're reading right here. So when we read about the Christmas goose, if this is associated to Osiris, well, now we have a better idea of what's going on here. It says, it was chosen to denote a son from its love of its young, being ready to give up itself to the chasseur, in order that it may be preserved, for which reason the Egyptians thought it right to revere this animal. Here then the true meaning of the symbol is a son, who voluntarily gives himself up as a sacrifice for those he loves via the pagan Messiah. So you can see how close Christianity and sun worship is, because before Christianity ever came on the scene, the pagans already had the idea of a son that would die for its followers and it would give itself up for them. That sounds a lot like Christ. So you can understand that once you start to blur the birth of Christ with the solstice, what are you doing? You're pushing people towards Osiris. It is then abundantly clear why the goose was sacrificed and eaten at Christmas, the ancient heathen Christmas in honor of the Babylonian solar deity. Another interesting thing is sometimes you'll say, well, we don't always eat turkey, or we don't always have a geese or a bird. Sometimes we have a pig. You should look up the festival of Hogmanay. Hogmanay was a Celtic tradition, and Hogmanay again fell on the solstice. So they had their pig during the winter solstice, and you'll find out that the goose and the pig were symbols to Osiris. So here we see this pillar of Asherah, and we notice the pillar of Asherah from the Old Testament sure looks like a lot like the Statue of Liberty, and sure looks like a lot like the Colossus seen at Rome. So is this some kind of a male-female deity? Well, here's the thing. Remember, Asherah represented the earth goddess. So if the earth is depicted in wintertime, it's depicted as one gender. If it's the summertime, it can be depicted as the other gender. So Asherah is actually a male and a female. Hence, when you see these statues, you're seeing both a male and a female. How about this? How would you describe a tree? Is a tree a male or is a tree a female? Now, keep in mind that trees have seeds, and then the seed comes from the tree, falls onto the ground, and then a new tree is made. So ultimately speaking, the tree and the earth itself show the symbol of a hermaphrodite, because the tree is both the offspring, but the tree is also inseminating, and the thing it inseminates is the earth it resides in. So this is where the symbol of androgyny came from. The Yule log is the dead stalk of Nimrod, deified as the sun god, but cut down by his enemies. The Christmas tree is Nimrod's Ridivus. The slain god come out to life again. In the story told by the Roman poet Ovid, the mother of Adonis being changed at the moment of giving him birth into a tree. As Adonis, the child was symbolized as the branch, his mother, in keeping with the symbol, must needs to have represented as a tree. So again, you're seeing that their deities were represented as the sun, but of course you've got something in the sky and you've got something on the ground. So when they would depict the deity above, they would depict the deity above using the sun. And when they would depict the deity below, the mother, the goddess, the male, female, they would use a tree. Santa, we mentioned, came from Odin. So, I mean, we're pulling from all over the place here. If you take a look, we're grabbing stuff from Babylon. We're grabbing stuff from Assyria. We're grabbing stuff from the Norse, which was later. You can't attribute Christmas to just one holiday. Saturnalia would probably be the closest holiday, because Saturnalia is where you're getting the date from, and Saturnalia is where you're getting the gift giving from, and the drunkenness, and then, of course, having your leadership serve you, the master serving the slaves. But we can see from the Norse, we've got this character that replaced Jesus. Instead of Jesus being the one who brings joy at his birth, we're seeing this other character, which we've called Father Christmas or Old Saint Nick, which we know is actually the deity Thor. And of course, Thor's father was Odin. And then Odin, we saw, had the sun cross. So notice we're just doing full circles here. As you study the sun god, you're always going to see the same answers coming up over and over and over again. So again, after Nimrod's death, Semiramis promoted the belief that he was a god. She claimed that he was a full-grown evergreen tree sprung out of the roots of a dead tree stump, symbolizing springing forth new life for Nimrod. And his birthday, we know, fell during the winter solstice. So in other words, December the 25th, if we're looking at the old calendar, or December the 21st, if we're looking at the newer calendar, the Gregorian calendar. So these are all the pieces as to where our Christmas tradition comes from. Christmas is not coming from the Bible. The name is obviously very misleading because you have the word Christ in there. But of course, when the early church fathers and obviously people today all confirm, you can't actually find, one, the date of Christ in the Bible. The name Christmas doesn't show up in the Bible. The traditions, the customs, none of those are in the Bible either, unless we're specifically taking a look at the book of Jeremiah. The only place we can find any custom of Christmas that shows up in the Bible is the book of Jeremiah. And in the book of Jeremiah, it's telling the people not to be dismayed by what's going on in the sky and not to put up a tree. So that's my piece on Christmas. There's actually quite a bit more. If you're really interested in this stuff, you want to know more about the history of Christmas, I recommend the book. It's called The Dark History of Christmas, The Pagan Origins of Our Winter Festival. It's by Heinz Schmidt. He actually goes forward from basically the 1600s till present day, going through a lot of the pieces that I showed you and obviously some that I haven't. If you want to know where each specific symbol came from, for example, the mistletoe, he goes through the mistletoe. The eggnog, he goes through all those pieces. I showed you a couple. I showed you the turkey. I showed you the pig. I showed you the wreath. I've showed you the Christmas tree. Obviously, there's a lot more symbols outside of Christmas than that. But in this book, he actually goes through and points to each different symbol and then where it came from. And you'll see it's just an amalgamation of all these solar worship religions. Personally, I don't care what people choose to celebrate. The problem is that within the church, since within the church, Christians don't typically know the history, when it comes to these holidays, they're extremely confused. I find Christians that are pointing out, oh, this is a Jewish holiday or this is a Christian holiday. And the funny part is this. The Jewish holidays, they can find them all in the Bible. The Christian holidays, there's none. So there's not so much as a difference between Christian holidays and Jewish holidays It's just that Christians are confused by church history. And the church history and what happened with the amalgamation of trying to bring all these people under one wing of the Catholic Church, just basically trying to consolidate Rome into one belief system. That's how you got all this intermixing. So the intermixing has made it now so that when people are looking at the symbol of Christ, there's the possibility that when they start doing some research, they're going to say, well, Christ is no different than Osiris. He's no different than Adonis. I mean, it would make sense that if you're trying to say that every civilization was basically pulling the same idea, it'd be kind of weird to say the Christians were doing something different. And the only way you can show the Christians' separateness from what was going on around them is by understanding in Deuteronomy, the Christians never worshiped the sun, the moon, or the stars. That was what the pagan nations did. And the second thing was that if you read through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you'd notice you don't actually get a date being on the solstice. So that was implied. So when you don't have that separation of Christ not being born on the solstice, what you fall prey to is the idea that Jesus might have been the sun. And if Jesus was the Son, well, then we don't so much have a God that created us. We just were created through a random series of natural events.
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Brothers and sisters, the sword is coming. If you hear the watchman's call, please repent and seek out Jesus Christ. There is still time. That at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow.